Welcome, history lovers, to a truly incredible journey back in time. Today, we're about to uncover one of the most fascinating and significant chapters in world history: how Britain went to war with China over opium. It's a story that has shaped the modern world in ways you might not expect. And while you may have heard bits and pieces of it, today we're diving deep into the heart of this conflict. We'll explore the origins of the British-China trade relationship, the escalating tensions, the major battles, and, of course, the lasting consequences that continue to echo through history. Now, I know history can sometimes feel overwhelming. There's so much to take in. But don't worry, because today's journey is going to be different. Why does this story matter, you might wonder? Well, the Opium Wars weren't just about the illegal trade of opium or the clash between two empires. They were about much more. They were about power, imperialism, and the birth of the modern global system we all interact with today. This was a pivotal moment that fundamentally altered global trade, geopolitics, and the balance of power between East and West. These wars shaped the path of modern history, and understanding them helps us make sense of the world we live in now. Trust me, you'll be glad you joined this journey. Over the next few hours, we'll travel through the past together. We'll start with the origins of Britain's trade relationship with China, then move through the series of events that led to the outbreak of war. And finally, we'll reflect on the long-lasting consequences that continue to shape global relations today. I'll be your guide, taking you through the twists and turns of this fascinating story in a way that's not just informative, but also soothing, accessible, and easy to follow. Think of this as a peaceful, engaging exploration through time. So go ahead, get comfortable, relax, and let's dive into a narrative that not only sheds light on the past, but will also give you fresh perspectives on how that past has shaped the world we live in today. Picture this. The morning fog hangs thick over the Pearl River, shrouding everything in a quiet, misty haze. You slowly open your eyes, blinking away the fog of sleep. You're in your cramped quarters aboard a British merchant ship, anchored just off the coast of Canton. The wooden planks beneath you creak and groan as the vessel gently sways with the rhythm of the water. So, before we set off on this historical adventure, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and get ready to explore one of the most transformative chapters of our shared history. Ready to begin? Let's go. The 19th century trade context. Before the conflict between Britain and China erupted into war, there was a thriving trade relationship between the two nations, one that was about much more than just goods. It was about power, influence, and economic control. The British demand for tea, silk, and porcelain from China and the imbalance in trade. In the early 19th century, Britain's trade with China was dominated by a small number of highly prized luxury goods: tea, silk, and porcelain. These items were deeply embedded in British society and culture, making them highly sought after. Tea had become a staple in British life, with the British aristocracy leading the way and making it a daily ritual by the late 1600s. By the 19th century, tea drinking had spread throughout all levels of British society. In fact, tea was more than just a drink. It was an important social and cultural element. The British people's obsession with tea drove a massive demand, with millions of pounds worth being imported each year. However, China was the sole producer of the finest tea, and it was only available in limited quantities. For Britain to keep up with demand, they had to purchase vast amounts from China, creating a significant imbalance in trade. The demand for Chinese silk and porcelain also grew during this period. Chinese silk was renowned for its high quality and was sought after by British weavers and textile manufacturers. Similarly, Chinese porcelain, Especially delicate items such as fine tea sets became highly fashionable among British elites. Both these products symbolized wealth and sophistication, and their demand was consistent, further deepening Britain's reliance on Chinese imports. However, while Britain was eagerly buying Chinese goods, China wasn't nearly as interested in British products. In fact, China, under the Qing Dynasty, largely viewed Britain and the West as inferior and unnecessary. Chinese officials were reluctant to open their markets to foreign goods, which created a huge trade imbalance. Britain was importing far more from China than it was exporting, and as a result, the British were losing large amounts of silver to pay for all the tea, silk, and porcelain they bought. Britain's solution to this trade imbalance: the introduction of opium. Faced with a growing trade deficit and limited options for reversing the imbalance, Britain found a solution that would have disastrous consequences for both nations: the introduction of opium into the Chinese market. The opium trade was not new to Britain. The British East India Company had long been involved in the production and distribution of opium in India, which was under British control. Opium poppies had been cultivated in India since the late 1700s, and British traders had begun to recognize the potential for profit in selling the drug. Initially, opium was a product sold to other markets, but as the demand for it grew, British traders saw a golden opportunity in China. Opium was highly addictive, and once introduced into the Chinese market, it quickly became a drug of choice for many Chinese consumers. At first, British traders faced resistance from the Chinese government, which had long understood the dangers of opium addiction. The Qing Dynasty had already tried to limit the importation of opium in an attempt to curb its destructive effects on Chinese society, but British traders, with the backing of the British East India Company, persisted. In the early 1800s, British traders began smuggling larger quantities of opium into China, often through the port of Canton, modern-day Guangzhou, where much of China's foreign trade took place. By the 1832s, British exports of opium were increasing rapidly. In exchange for opium, British merchants could secure huge quantities of Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain. This trade, which was completely unregulated, allowed Britain to balance its trade deficit. While the British saw this as a pragmatic solution to their economic problems, the social consequences for China were catastrophic. The widespread addiction to opium in China caused severe social and economic damage. It devastated families, weakened the workforce, and drained China's wealth as vast amounts of silver flowed out of the country to fund the opium trade. The public health crisis was compounded by the fact that opium smoking was becoming increasingly popular, and the Chinese government could do little to stop the influx of the drug. Despite these devastating effects, Britain continued to push for the trade, seeing it as a crucial means of securing the goods they wanted from China while avoiding the loss of silver. The opium trade would soon become the flashpoint for the conflict that would ignite the First Opium War in 1839. The rise of the opium trade. As we move further into the story, it's crucial to understand how opium, a highly addictive drug, became one of the most significant commodities in the trade between Britain and China, setting the stage for conflict. Opium became a key commodity in Anglo-Chinese trade. By the early 19th century, Britain found itself in a deep trade deficit with China. As we've discussed, Britain was importing vast amounts of tea, silk, and porcelain, but China had little interest in the goods Britain was offering in return. To balance this trade, Britain turned to a more profitable and controversial solution: opium. The British East India Company, which held a monopoly on British trade in the region, saw an opportunity in the drug trade. Initially, opium had been grown and traded in other regions, but in the early 1800s, It was in India that the British saw the chance to change the dynamics. The demand for opium in China was rapidly growing, and so the British began exporting it in large quantities to China. Opium quickly became a key part of the economic relationship between Britain and China. It was not only a solution to Britain's trade imbalance, but it also became a profitable business venture for the British East India Company. The opium trade expanded drastically, with the drug flowing into China at an alarming rate. It was sold at significant profit, while the British, in return, received valuable Chinese goods like tea, silk, and porcelain. This marked a dark shift in British trade policies and is one of the primary reasons for the rise of tension between the two countries. What began as a strategic trade move quickly escalated into something much more problematic: opium addiction, which would have devastating social and economic consequences for China. The role of India, British-controlled, as a major supplier of opium. The opium trade was tightly connected to British colonial interests in India. India, at the time a British colony, became the primary source of opium for the East India Company. The British had been growing opium in India since the late 1700s, and by the 19th century, the production had been expanded to meet the demands of China. Opium was grown in the fertile plains of Bengal and other parts of British-controlled India. The British East India Company controlled its production and distribution, overseeing every aspect of the trade. The opium was shipped from Indian ports, including Calcutta, to China, where it was sold to Chinese traders. By the early 19th century, the opium trade had become a massive industry for Britain. The British were able to profit immensely from the sale of opium, while also ensuring the continued flow of Chinese tea and other goods. What began as a small-scale trade turned into a multi-million-dollar business, making opium a cornerstone of British imperial economic strategy. This trade, however, came at a terrible cost. While British traders and the British East India Company reaped the financial rewards, the Chinese people suffered the consequences. The addiction to opium rapidly spread throughout China, affecting all layers of society. The social fabric of Chinese life began to deteriorate as millions of people fell into addiction, while the British continued to profit from this destructive trade. Social conditions in China. The growing impact of opium on Chinese society. As the opium trade expanded, it began to have a devastating impact on Chinese society. Opium addiction became widespread, affecting not just the poor and working class, but also many of the elite and government officials. The addiction spread rapidly across the country, fueled by the ease of access to the drug and the large profits it generated. At first, opium was consumed primarily by the upper classes and merchants who could afford it. However, as the trade grew, so did its availability, and addiction spread throughout society. It wasn't long before opium became a common addiction among all social classes in China, from laborers to intellectuals, and even members of the imperial court. Opium addiction didn't just harm individuals, it undermined the very structure of Chinese society. Families were destroyed as members fell into addiction. The workforce was weakened as more and more people became dependent on the drug. Productivity plummeted, and agricultural output declined. Opium trade profits siphoned off China's wealth, sending silver and resources flowing out of the country. The widespread addiction created economic instability in China. Wealth that had previously been spent on tea, silk, and porcelain now went towards purchasing opium. This had a ripple effect, depleting China's wealth and forcing it to rely more heavily on foreign trade to fuel its economy. What had once been a prosperous, self-sufficient nation was now dealing with a crippling economic crisis brought on by the addiction to opium. The Qing government, seeing the devastation caused by the opium trade, tried to implement laws and policies to reduce the flow of opium into the country. The most famous figure in this effort was Lin Zexu, the imperial commissioner sent to Canton, Guangzhou, to end the opium trade. He began a campaign to destroy opium stocks and enforce the emperor's prohibition of the drug. However, despite his efforts, the opium trade continued to thrive, as British merchants were determined to keep the trade profitable, and they had the backing of the British East India Company. As addiction spread and the effects of opium became even more pronounced in Chinese society, the Qing government grew desperate. They realized that the country's very survival was at stake, and that their efforts to curb the opium trade might be the only way to save China from complete collapse. This realization set the stage for the first major conflict between China and Britain, which would eventually become known as the First Opium War. China's anti-opium policies. As the opium trade flourished and its destructive effects became undeniable, the Chinese government, under the Qing Dynasty, recognized that the widespread addiction to the drug was tearing apart the social fabric of their society. By the 1832, it was clear that China could no longer ignore the epidemic of opium addiction and the consequences it was having on the country's economy, health, and stability. Opium, once a commodity enjoyed by a select few in Chinese society, had become a national crisis. As addiction spread across all layers of society, from peasants and laborers to intellectuals and even members of the elite, it became impossible for the Qing government to ignore the severe consequences of the opium trade. Not only was the drug wreaking havoc on public health, but it was also draining China's wealth and undermining the strength of its workforce. The Qing Dynasty, led by the Emperor Daoguang at the time, was deeply concerned about the social and economic damage caused by opium. By the early 1832s, reports had reached the imperial court about the rapid increase in the number of opium smokers and the dire social effects. The government realized that the addiction problem was not only a health crisis, but was also having a debilitating effect on China's agricultural output and overall economic productivity. More importantly, the Qing authorities were alarmed by the fact that vast amounts of silver were leaving China to pay for the opium being imported from Britain. This drain on China's wealth further exacerbated the country's trade imbalance with Britain. The government realized that unless the flow of opium was stopped, China's sovereignty and stability were at risk. In 1839, the Qing emperor appointed Lin Zexu as the imperial commissioner to address the opium crisis. Lin was a prominent and respected official known for his integrity and strong moral convictions. He was given the monumental task of curbing the opium trade in southern China, specifically in the city of Canton, Guangzhou, where the majority of foreign trade occurred. Lin Zexu's actions were decisive and uncompromising. He ordered the confiscation and destruction of large quantities of opium stockpiled by British traders in Canton. Lin's most notable action was in June 1839, when he ordered the destruction of over 1,000 chests of opium, worth millions of dollars, which had been stored in the warehouses of foreign merchants. This bold move was meant to send a clear message that the Qing government would no longer tolerate the illegal opium trade, and that foreign powers could not continue to poison Chinese society. Lin's campaign was not just about destroying opium. It was a broader effort to restore China's sovereignty and reassert its authority over foreign trade. Lin also took measures to arrest Chinese opium dealers and enact stricter regulations on opium use and trade within China. His actions were in line with the emperor's desire to rid the country of the opium menace and protect China's people from the devastating effects of addiction. However, Lin's actions would soon lead to an escalation in tensions between the British traders and Chinese authorities. The British traders, who were heavily invested in the opium trade, viewed Lin's actions as a direct attack on their business interests. They saw the destruction of their goods as an affront to British honor and a violation of their rights as merchants. Lin Zexu's crackdown on the opium trade ignited tensions between China and Britain, tensions that had been simmering for years but had now reached a boiling point. The British were infuriated by the destruction of their opium stocks and demanded compensation for their losses. The Chinese government, under Lin's leadership, refused to pay any reparations, as they viewed the British trade in opium as an immoral and illegal activity that needed to be eradicated. In response to Lin's actions, the British government took a hardline approach. The British East India Company, along with other British merchants, lobbied the British government to intervene. The British government, led by Prime Minister Viscount Palmerston, was quick to support the interests of British traders and saw China's actions as a violation of British rights under international law. Britain's response was swift military intervention. The British government, under pressure from its traders, decided to send a military expedition to China to force the Qing Dynasty to resume the opium trade and secure other trading rights. The British saw the destruction of opium as a threat to their profitable trade and were unwilling to allow China to dictate the terms of their commercial relationship. On the other hand, China saw the British demand for the resumption of the opium trade as a matter of national sovereignty. Lin Zexu and the Qing government had made it clear that they would not back down on their anti-opium policies. This clash of interests, along with the refusal of both sides to compromise, ultimately led to the outbreak of the First Opium War in 1839, escalating diplomatic tensions. The events in Canton, Guangzhou, in 1839 marked the beginning of a deep and lasting rift between Britain and China. The British response to the Chinese crackdown on the opium trade set the stage for a dramatic escalation of tensions, eventually leading to war. As the situation unfolded, diplomatic relations between the two nations, already fragile due to conflicting interests, broke down completely. The British were incensed by the actions of Lin Zexu and the Qing government. The seizure and destruction of over 1,000 chests of opium by Lin in June 1839 was seen as an outright attack on British property and trade rights. The British East India Company, which was the main vehicle for opium trade, had substantial financial stakes in the business, and their profits were now at risk. For the British, the destruction of the opium was not just a loss of property, it was an affront to British honor and a direct challenge to their commercial interests in China. The British response was swift and determined. Initially, Britain sought diplomatic solutions, sending a formal protest to the Qing government demanding compensation for the destroyed opium. However, the Chinese government, under the leadership of Lin Zexu, refused to offer any reparations, instead asserting that the opium trade was illegal and that China had every right to protect its citizens from the devastating effects of the drug. This refusal to negotiate set the stage for the breakdown of diplomatic relations. The British government, which had already been under pressure from powerful business interests in India and China, began to view China's actions as a violation of British sovereignty. The loss of their opium stockpiles was not just a financial blow, it was seen as an insult to Britain's position as a rising global power. As a result, Britain shifted its focus from diplomatic protests to military action. The diplomatic breakdowns that followed were a direct consequence of both the destruction of British property and the failure of China to respond to Britain's demands for compensation. In the months following the destruction of the opium, the British government made repeated attempts to open a dialogue with China, sending envoys and issuing formal protests to the Qing court. However, these efforts were met with disdain and indifference by the Qing Dynasty. The Chinese viewed their stance on opium as a matter of national sovereignty and moral responsibility. The emperor's ministers, including Lin Zexu, were firm in their belief that their actions were justified, and they refused to back down. The Qing Dynasty's reluctance to engage diplomatically with Britain, combined with their refusal to accept British demands, worsened the situation. Britain, which had already been growing frustrated with China's refusal to open more trade ports or grant favorable trade terms, now saw the opium issue as a direct challenge to their national honor and commercial interests. The diplomatic failure to resolve the crisis pushed Britain toward a military response. The British saw themselves as having the right to defend their economic interests in China, and the failure of diplomacy in the face of China's resistance ultimately led to the escalation of hostilities. In the years leading up to the outbreak of the First Opium War, British policy toward China began to shift dramatically. The initial British approach had been one of negotiation, but after the opium crisis and the diplomatic failure to resolve the dispute, Britain adopted a more aggressive stance. The British government, led by Prime Minister Viscount Palmerston, increasingly saw the opium trade as central to Britain's economic interests in China. British merchants and the East India Company had significant financial stakes in the success of the opium trade, and their pressure on the government grew louder. Britain's imperial ambitions were also at play. As the British Empire expanded its global reach, there was a growing belief that China needed to be brought into the global economic system, and the opium trade was seen as a key part of that process. By 1840, Britain was committed to using military force to compel China to open its markets further, to pay reparations for the opium destroyed, and to ensure that the opium trade would continue unhindered. British forces began to prepare for war, and military leaders were mobilized to carry out Britain's objectives in China. The British viewed China's refusal to comply as an attempt to block their imperial ambitions in Asia, and the opium issue had become a rallying cry for Britain's national pride and economic interests. The stage was set for the First Opium War, a war that would have far-reaching consequences for China and the world. As tensions between Britain and China grew, the British policy of military intervention seemed inevitable, especially after the diplomatic efforts failed and both sides refused to back down. Key figures in the conflict. As the Opium War escalated, a few key figures emerged who played pivotal roles in shaping the conflict's outcome. These individuals, representing both China and Britain, not only influenced the decisions of their respective governments, but also became symbols of the broader struggle over trade, sovereignty, and imperialism. In this section, we'll explore the roles of the central figures on both sides of the conflict: Lin Zexu, Charles Elliot, and other significant players who had a lasting impact on the war's course. Lin Zexu stands as one of the most significant and respected figures in the history of China's resistance against imperialism. Appointed by the Qing Emperor in 1839, Lin was tasked with eradicating the opium trade in southern China, specifically in the key port city of Canton, Guangzhou, where foreign trade, particularly the opium trade, flourished. Lin Zexu's approach to tackling the opium crisis was both forceful and unwavering. He was committed to protecting Chinese society from the ravages of addiction, which had been spreading rapidly throughout the population. Lin understood that the opium trade was not just a health issue, it was a matter of national sovereignty. The British were not only poisoning the people of China, but they were also draining the country's wealth and undermining its stability. In June 1839, Lin ordered the confiscation of over 1,000 chests of opium from British merchants in Canton, a dramatic and symbolic gesture that marked the beginning of a direct confrontation between Britain and China. He also organized the destruction of the opium, which was seen as an act of defiance against British economic interests and a symbol of Chinese resistance to foreign interference. Lin Zexu's actions, while driven by a deep sense of moral responsibility and national pride, made him a target of British anger. His uncompromising stance on opium would later be cited as one of the primary reasons for the outbreak of the First Opium War. Despite facing immense pressure from British forces and the British government, Lin's resolve remained unshaken, and he became a symbol of resistance and patriotism in China. On the British side, Charles Elliot played a central role in the unfolding of the Opium War. Elliot was a British diplomat and the chief superintendent of British trade in China at the time. He was responsible for representing British interests in China and overseeing British trade, which included the lucrative opium trade. Elliot, unlike some of his more aggressive counterparts, was somewhat hesitant about resorting to military force. Initially, he sought to avoid war by trying to negotiate a resolution with Chinese officials. However, as tensions rose and Lin Zexu's actions became more confrontational, Elliot's position grew increasingly untenable. He was caught between the interests of the British merchants, who were desperate to continue the opium trade, and the diplomatic pressure from his government to assert British power. Despite his reservations, Elliot eventually gave in to the pressures of the British government and merchants. He played a significant role in preparing for military action against China, eventually leading British forces in the early stages of the Opium War. His diplomatic efforts to resolve the crisis were unsuccessful, and his decision to escalate the conflict made him a key figure in Britain's decision to go to war with China. Although Elliot's role in the war was pivotal, he was criticized by both his superiors and some of the British merchants for his indecisiveness. In the end, his actions contributed to Britain's aggressive stance in the war, though he would later be replaced by more hardline figures in the aftermath of the conflict. While Lin Zexu and Charles Elliot were the central figures, several other individuals and groups had a significant impact on the outcome of the First Opium War. Admiral Sir William Parker. As the commander of the British naval forces during the Opium War, Admiral Parker played a crucial role in the British victory. He led the British Navy in several decisive battles, including the attack on Chinese coastal cities. Parker's leadership ensured that Britain could leverage its superior naval technology to defeat the Qing forces, who were ill-equipped for naval combat. His naval supremacy was a decisive factor in the eventual British success. Major General Sir Hugh Gough. A prominent British Army officer, Sir Hugh Gough, commanded British land forces during the war. He led British troops in key battles, including the capture of Canton and the decisive Battle of Chunpi, which gave Britain control over critical locations in southern China. Gough's military prowess was instrumental in securing Britain's victory and ensuring that China would be forced to agree to British terms in the Treaty of Nanking. Qing Dynasty officials. Emperor Daoguang. During the First Opium War, Emperor Daoguang was the ruling monarch of the Qing Dynasty. His reign was marked by mounting internal strife, economic instability, and growing foreign pressure, particularly from Britain. As the opium crisis worsened, the emperor faced a delicate balancing act. He had to maintain control over his vast empire while also resisting foreign interference and protecting China's sovereignty. The opium trade was increasingly viewed as a devastating scourge, both a health crisis and a social menace, deeply impacting Chinese society. The influx of opium undermined the economy, ravaged communities, and led to widespread addiction. The emperor, concerned about the moral degradation and social consequences of opium use, understood the urgency of the situation. Faced with the growing tide of British influence, which had turned opium into a major trade commodity, Emperor Daoguang made a pivotal decision. He appointed Lin Zexu as the imperial commissioner to take strong action against the trade. Lin Zexu's mission was clear: eradicate opium and end British dominance in the drug trade. His efforts included the seizure and destruction of opium stocks held by British merchants, a bold and highly symbolic action that infuriated the British. Lin's crackdown was not just an attempt to protect public health, it was also a reflection of the Qing government's growing resistance to foreign interference. Lin's uncompromising stance against the opium trade was a manifestation of the emperor's desire to protect China's sovereignty and reassert the country's authority over its own affairs. However, despite Emperor Daoguang's resolve to defend China's sovereignty, the Qing Dynasty was unable to effectively defend its borders or maintain internal stability. This failure to adapt to the changing military and technological realities of the 19th century, coupled with corruption and inefficiency within the imperial court, contributed to China's eventual military defeat by the superior British forces. The Qing government's inability to enforce its will effectively against the British Empire led to the signing of the Treaty of Nanking, a humiliating agreement that marked the beginning of a century of foreign dominance. Zhuozongtang. While Zhuozongtang did not play a key role during the First Opium War, 1839 to 1842, his legacy as a military leader and statesman during the late Qing Dynasty is of utmost importance in understanding China's eventual recovery from the devastating consequences of the Opium Wars. Zhuo would rise to prominence in the wake of the Qing Dynasty's defeat in the Second Opium War, 1856 to 1860, when China was again forced to make humiliating concessions to the West. Zhuozongtang is best known for his efforts to modernize China's military and to resist further foreign encroachment in the latter part of the 19th century. His role in the self-strengthening movement during the late Qing period was pivotal. He promoted the development of modern military techniques and the adoption of Western technology, while also pushing for internal reforms to strengthen China's ability to defend itself against foreign powers. Zhuo's leadership in defending China's territorial integrity during the Taiping Rebellion, 1850 to 1864, and his later role in the Sino-French War, 1884 to 1885, helped stabilize the Qing Dynasty at a time when many believed it was on the verge of collapse. By the late 19th century, Zhuozongtang's efforts to bring China's military into the modern age were beginning to show results. Under his leadership, China regained some degree of autonomy, which had been severely eroded by the Opium Wars and the treaties that followed. Zhuo's approach to reform, however, was not without its critics. While he promoted Western-style military technologies, his belief in Confucian values and Chinese traditions kept him somewhat cautious about embracing full-scale modernization. Yet Zhuozongtang's legacy remains vital, as he became one of the most important figures in China's post-Opium War recovery and laid the groundwork for future leaders who would continue to push for China's independence and strength on the world stage. Finally, it's important to consider the role of British merchants and public opinion in shaping the conflict. While the British government was motivated by national prestige and imperial interests, it was the economic interests of British merchants, particularly those profiting from the opium trade, that truly influenced the escalation of the conflict. British merchants, including those affiliated with the British East India Company, saw the opium trade as a highly profitable venture. By the 1832, opium had become one of Britain's most valuable exports to China, fueling huge profits for British traders and merchants. As the Chinese government increasingly cracked down on the opium trade, British merchants became vocal in their demands for military intervention to protect their investments. These merchants lobbied the British government, arguing that China's refusal to honor trade rights and continued interference with the opium trade necessitated forceful action. Public opinion in Britain was also a key factor in the conflict. While many Britons were indifferent to the plight of the Chinese people, the economic benefits of the opium trade were widely recognized. The trade provided much-needed income, particularly after Britain's costly wars with France and other European powers. Public sentiment, in general, was influenced by the media, which often portrayed the Chinese as backward, unwilling to modernize, and even incapable of governing themselves. This perception justified British intervention in China as part of a larger, civilizing mission. The British press framed the war as a way to open up China's markets and to bring civilization to the barbarians. While many in Britain supported military intervention, a moral debate did arise regarding the ethics of the opium trade. Some abolitionists and philanthropists in Britain, appalled by the human cost of addiction, spoke out against the wars, arguing that British imperialism was exploiting and degrading the Chinese people for economic gain. However, this opposition was relatively weak compared to the overwhelming support for Britain's imperial ambitions in China. The outbreak of war, 1839. The year 1839 marked the beginning of a critical and dramatic chapter in history, the outbreak of the First Opium War. What had started as a diplomatic dispute over the opium trade quickly escalated into a full-scale military conflict between China and Britain. This section delves into the events leading up to the war, the first battles, and the technological advancements that played a crucial role in shaping the outcome. The immediate cause of the First Opium War was the actions of Lin Zexu, the Qing Dynasty official tasked with eradicating the opium trade. In 1839, Lin ordered the confiscation of over 1,000 chests of opium that had been stored by British merchants in the port city of Canton, Guangzhou. The destruction of this opium was a direct blow to British trade interests, as the opium market was worth millions of dollars, and many British traders, as well as the British East India Company, relied on the trade to balance their financial accounts. Lin's actions were viewed by the British as an act of aggression and a violation of their rights. In their eyes, the destruction of opium was not just an attack on their goods, but an affront to British honor and commercial privilege. The British government, under Prime Minister Viscount Palmerston, took a hard-line stance, refusing to allow China to disrupt their lucrative opium trade. With diplomatic negotiations having failed, Britain began to seriously consider military intervention. At first, British officials sought peaceful negotiations. They sent envoys to China demanding compensation for the destroyed opium and the immediate reopening of trade ports to ensure British interests were preserved. But the Qing government, led by Emperor Daoguang and the unyielding Lin Zexu, was steadfast in its refusal to acknowledge British demands, viewing the opium trade as immoral and destructive to Chinese society. The deadlock made military action seem inevitable, as British merchants and politicians grew increasingly frustrated by the lack of resolution. In response, Britain made the decision to deploy military forces to China. The British government justified its decision by claiming the need to protect British citizens and commercial interests in China. Britain's military response was swift and overwhelming, with a modern and well-equipped naval force prepared to engage the Qing Dynasty's forces. The First Opium War began in the summer of 1839, with British forces making their first moves against Chinese positions along the coast. The British Navy, equipped with superior ships and artillery, launched attacks on Chinese coastal cities and ports. The British strategy focused on using their naval power to strike at key Chinese ports and disrupt their supply lines. One of the first major actions of the war was the British attack on Canton, Guangzhou, the hub of the opium trade. British ships, including powerful warships like the HMS Nemesis, bombarded Chinese forts and cities along the coast. The Chinese military, relying largely on outdated tactics and poorly equipped ships, was unable to effectively defend against the British assault. As the British forces advanced, they quickly captured several important coastal cities, including Chuzan and Canton. forcing the Chinese government to consider the possibility of a full-scale war. The Chinese response, led by their naval forces, was disorganized and ineffective, further highlighting the technological gap between the two sides. The British military was not only superior in naval firepower, but also in logistical coordination. Their ability to rapidly deploy troops and supplies via steam-powered vessels gave them a significant advantage. British forces also used advanced tactics, such as landing troops to attack Chinese fortifications from multiple angles, which further undermined the Qing military's defense efforts. One of the most decisive factors in the outcome of the First Opium War was the technological superiority of the British military. During this period, Britain had a significant edge in military technology, particularly in naval warfare. Two key advancements that played a crucial role were steamships and advanced weaponry. Steamships. Perhaps the most significant technological advancement that Britain brought to the war was the steamship. The British Navy had begun integrating steam-powered warships into its fleet in the early 19th century, and by the time the First Opium War broke out, these steamships were revolutionizing naval combat. Steamships provided the British with unmatched mobility and speed, critical advantages over the traditional wooden sailing ships used by the Chinese Navy. Steam-powered vessels could travel much faster and more reliably than their sailing counterparts. They were not dependent on the unpredictable forces of wind, allowing the British to move with precision and control, even in adverse weather conditions. This gave British warships a massive advantage, as they could strike unexpectedly, move rapidly between different locations, and maintain continuous naval presence along China's coastline. The ability to navigate through both open waters and narrow riverways with ease allowed the British Navy to carry out swift and effective attacks on Chinese ports, fortifications, and cities such as Canton and Shuzhen, which were pivotal to the outcome of the war. In contrast, the Chinese Navy was still heavily reliant on traditional sailing ships, made of wood and powered by wind. These ships were far slower and less maneuverable, especially when compared to the speed and agility of the British steamships. In battle, the Chinese ships struggled to keep up with the British and were vulnerable to rapid, highly coordinated strikes. The steamships could travel in any weather, while the Chinese ships were often left stranded or ineffective when winds weren't favorable. This technological gap in naval mobility allowed the British to dominate the seas and cut off China's vital trade routes, forcing the Qing government to the negotiating table. Advanced weaponry. Alongside steamships, another critical factor in Britain's victory was their advanced weaponry, which gave their forces an overwhelming advantage. British ships were armed with modern artillery, including long-range cannons and heavier guns, capable of firing explosive shells over long distances with remarkable accuracy. These weapons were far superior to the Chinese arsenal, allowing British ships to bombard Chinese defenses from beyond the range of the Chinese cannons. The British ships could approach Chinese fortifications, such as the ones around Canton, and open fire from a safe distance, causing extensive damage without having to engage in close-quarter combat. The ability to bombard cities and forts from afar without exposing themselves to direct retaliation was a game-changer. The British Navy could hit Chinese ships or coastal fortifications repeatedly, crippling them before they even had a chance to retaliate. By contrast, the Chinese military was equipped with outdated weaponry, including older cannons and rifles, many of which were less effective at long range. The Chinese cannons, though formidable in their own right, could not match the range and firepower of the British artillery. As a result, when the Chinese attempted to engage in battle, they were outgunned and outmatched. The Chinese were also using smoothbore muskets, which lacked the precision of the rifled muskets used by the British. Rifled muskets, with their grooved barrels, imparted a spin to the bullet, making them more accurate and effective at longer distances. This provided the British with a significant advantage during land battles, allowing them to engage the Chinese forces from a greater distance with deadly precision. These technological disparities were crucial in determining the outcome of the First Opium War. From the sea to the land, British military superiority enabled them to carry out successful attacks, weaken Chinese defenses, and cripple the Qing Dynasty's ability to respond effectively. The British were able to launch rapid strikes on key Chinese cities, seizing control of important coastal areas such as Canton and Chuzan. By exploiting their technological advantages, the British forced the Chinese to reconsider their position, both militarily and diplomatically. As the war continued, the technological gap between the two sides only grew wider. The Qing Dynasty's naval fleet remained outdated, and its military technologies were ill-suited for the demands of modern warfare. Meanwhile, the British continued to innovate, further cementing their dominance. The disparity in firepower, mobility, and weaponry made it increasingly difficult for the Qing forces to mount an effective defense. The First Opium War ultimately ended with the signing of the Treaty of Nanking in 1842, a humiliating defeat for China that forced them to open more ports to foreign trade, cede Hong Kong, and pay massive indemnities. The victory also had lasting implications for the British Empire, which was able to establish a dominant role in Chinese trade, including the controversial and profitable opium trade. The technological innovations employed by the British Navy during the war changed the course of history. The steamships and advanced weaponry showcased the power of industrial-era technologies and their ability to reshape global geopolitics. In the end, these advantages played a decisive role in the British victory and set the stage for further imperialist expansion in the East. The naval battles and British superiority. The First Opium War was not only a battle of ideologies and interests, but also a confrontation of military power, particularly naval power. One of the key reasons Britain was able to secure victory in this conflict was its naval superiority. This section delves into the significant naval engagements between the British and Chinese forces, the tactics used by the British to overcome the Chinese military, and the profound impact that technological disparities had on the course of the war. The British Navy was the backbone of Britain's military strategy during the First Opium War. Britain's advanced naval technology, including steam-powered warships, superior weaponry, and well-trained sailors, played a crucial role in defeating the Chinese forces, who were still relying on outdated naval tactics and wooden ships. One of the first key naval engagements occurred in 1839, just after the British launched their attack on Canton. The British forces, under the command of Admiral Sir William Parker, quickly gained control over the South China Sea. The British Navy targeted key Chinese coastal cities, including Canton, Guangzhou, Chuzan, and Ningbo, all of which were vital to China's economy and its defense against foreign powers. One of the most significant battles was the Battle of the Bogue, also known as the First Battle of the Bogue, which took place in the Bogue Human Strait, near Canton. The British forces, using their steam-powered warships, easily outmaneuvered the Chinese fleet, which was primarily made up of outdated wooden sailing ships. The Chinese fleet was destroyed, and the British Navy was able to blockade key Chinese ports, disrupting trade and forcing China to confront the superior military capabilities of Britain. The Battle of Chwenpi, another pivotal naval engagement, further demonstrated British naval superiority. During this battle, British warships destroyed Chinese fortifications and ships at Chwenpi, a critical location for China's defense. The Chinese forces were unable to withstand the British bombardment, and the British gained control of key strategic positions along the Chinese coast. These victories were crucial in undermining China's resistance and paving the way for British demands. British military tactics during the First Opium War were characterized by strategic innovation, precision, and an overwhelming application of superior force. The British forces were well prepared, highly organized, and equipped with cutting-edge technology that gave them a significant advantage over the Qing forces. Unlike the Chinese, who were still largely reliant on traditional methods of warfare and outdated equipment, the British military adapted quickly to the changing nature of modern combat. Their ability to deploy advanced tactics, along with their superior naval firepower, allowed them to dominate the early stages of the conflict and achieve rapid success. Naval bombardment. One of the most decisive factors in the British success was their extensive use of naval bombardment, particularly from long-range artillery. The British Navy had been heavily invested in technological advancements, with steam-powered warships equipped with modern artillery capable of delivering devastating blows to enemy targets from a distance. British ships were armed with long-range cannons and explosive shells that could reach Chinese coastal fortifications, allowing them to inflict heavy damage without risking close-quarter combat. Unlike the Chinese, who relied on wooden warships and close combat tactics, the British Navy had the capability to strike from outside the range of Chinese artillery. British warships could approach Chinese positions and bombard them from far beyond the reach of the Chinese cannons, causing widespread destruction to fortifications, ports, and coastal cities. The Chinese defenders were often caught off guard, as they had no way to respond effectively to the British long-range bombardment. The precision and firepower of British naval guns were crucial in breaking through Chinese defenses, making it extremely difficult for the Qing forces to regroup or mount a successful counteroffensive. Fortifications that had stood for centuries crumbled under the relentless British bombardment, and cities such as Canton, Guangzhou, and Chuzan were heavily damaged, forcing the Chinese to retreat. The psychological impact of these devastating attacks left the Chinese forces demoralized, unable to respond effectively to the British military's relentless onslaught. Landing troops. In addition to their powerful naval bombardment, the British also employed amphibious warfare tactics that allowed them to land troops on Chinese shores and capture vital locations. After softening up the Chinese defenses with long-range bombardment from their warships, British forces would disembark on strategic coastal areas to secure key positions. This method of warfare allowed the British to create a two-pronged assault, hitting Chinese defenses both from the sea and from the land. One of the most notable examples of this amphibious tactic was the capture of Chusan, also known as Zhoushan Island, which was a crucial port located off the coast of Zhejiang province. The British Navy's success in seizing Chusan opened a vital route for further British advances along the Chinese coast, providing a base from which they could launch more attacks. The capture of Chusan not only disrupted Chinese defenses, but also gave the British a strategic foothold that allowed them to dominate vital trade routes and military positions along the coast. The ability to land troops quickly and surprise the enemy, combined with the overwhelming naval bombardment they had already unleashed, gave the British forces a distinct advantage. The Chinese were ill-prepared to deal with these surprise attacks, which often left them scrambling to defend key cities and fortifications that they had not expected to be targeted. Control of key ports and waterways. One of the most significant impacts of British military strategy was their ability to seize control of China's vital ports and waterways. The British understood that to force China into submission, they needed to disrupt the country's economic heart and cripple its ability to supply and resupply its forces. The British Navy quickly established control over Canton, Guangzhou, Chuzan, and other key coastal ports, effectively cutting off China's trade routes and supply lines. Control of these ports allowed the British to dominate China's trade, which was central to the Qing Dynasty's economic stability. The British were able to force China into a trade imbalance in their favor, and the Chinese economy, already strained by the opium crisis, suffered even further. By controlling these key waterways, the British Navy could also prevent the Chinese from receiving much-needed reinforcements or supplies from other regions of the empire. This blockade of China's coastline was an effective strategy to weaken the Qing government's military capabilities and force them into negotiations. The British naval dominance in these vital ports and waterways also allowed for a continuous military presence along China's coast. This presence ensured that the British could sustain their pressure on the Chinese government, preventing them from gaining any foothold in the conflict and making it nearly impossible for the Qing to rally support for a large-scale defense effort. The British ability to control key strategic locations proved critical in their success and contributed to the Qing dynasty's eventual defeat. Psychological warfare. While British tactics on the battlefield were formidable, they also employed psychological warfare to undermine Chinese morale. The sight of British warships, with their steam engines, advanced artillery, and well-trained crews, struck fear into the Chinese. The British Navy created a sense of overwhelming force, intimidating the Chinese and leading them to question their ability to defend their shores. The psychological impact of British technological superiority cannot be underestimated. Chinese soldiers and civilians, many of whom had never seen such advanced weaponry or such powerful warships, were often overwhelmed by the sight of the British Navy. The British ships, with their massive hulls and towering masts, were unlike anything the Chinese had encountered before, and their power was enough to break the Chinese spirit. The psychological pressure that the British applied by bombarding cities from afar, landing troops where they were least expected, and maintaining a continuous naval presence played a significant role in the rapid surrender of Chinese forces in key battles. As the war progressed, this psychological warfare made it increasingly difficult for the Qing government to maintain public confidence or morale within the military. This weakened resistance ultimately forced the Chinese to negotiate a peace settlement that favored British interests. One of the most significant factors in the British victory in the First Opium War was the disparity in military technology between Britain and China. While Britain was armed with the most advanced weaponry and technology of the time, China's military forces were still operating with outdated and inadequate equipment. Steamships versus sailing ships. One of the most glaring technological disparities was in naval vessels. Britain had a fleet of steam-powered warships such as the HMS Nemesis, which could travel faster and more efficiently than China's wooden sailing ships. The British steamships could move against the wind and navigate through difficult weather conditions, while China's ships were entirely reliant on favorable winds. This gave Britain unparalleled mobility and allowed them to launch surprise attacks and outmaneuver the Chinese. Superior artillery. The British Navy was equipped with modern artillery, including long-range cannons and exploding shells. This allowed them to strike at Chinese ships and fortifications from a distance, inflicting massive damage before the Chinese could retaliate. The Chinese military, on the other hand, was still using outdated firearms and cannons that lacked the range and firepower of British weaponry. Well-trained soldiers versus ill-prepared troops. The British military was well-trained and professional, with experienced officers and soldiers who were accustomed to modern warfare tactics. British sailors and soldiers were well-versed in the use of advanced technology, while Chinese troops were largely untrained in the use of modern firearms and lacked the experience to fight against a well-organized and technologically superior enemy. Weak Chinese defenses. While China had large numbers of soldiers and ships, Their defenses were disorganized and poorly equipped to deal with the British onslaught. The Chinese military leadership was also hampered by bureaucratic inefficiency and internal divisions, which further weakened their ability to defend against the technologically superior British forces. The Chinese military had no effective strategy for combating the new technologies that Britain brought to the conflict, and this left them vulnerable to British attacks. The technological gap between Britain and China had devastating consequences for China. Despite their large population and vast territory, China's military forces were unable to withstand the British technological superiority. The Chinese were forced to surrender key ports and cities, leading to the eventual signing of the Treaty of Nanking in 1842, which would grant Britain significant concessions and set the stage for further foreign influence in China. The defeat also had a lasting impact on China's perception of its own power and its place in the world. The military defeat exposed the weaknesses of the Qing Dynasty and led to widespread internal discontent. The Opium Wars would go on to be a defining moment in Chinese history, leading to the so-called Century of Humiliation, during which China was subjected to foreign domination, unequal treaties, and internal strife. China's defeat. After months of intense military conflict, it became clear that the Chinese forces were no match for the might of the British military. The disparity in technology, naval superiority, and military tactics played a decisive role in the swift collapse of Chinese resistance. In this section, we'll explore the fall of key cities, including Canton, Guangzhou, the crushing military defeat suffered by China, and the eventual decision by the Chinese government to enter peace talks, marking a pivotal moment in the conflict. One of the first major blows to China came when British forces successfully captured Canton, Guangzhou, the central hub of foreign trade in China and the epicenter of the opium trade. As previously discussed, the British Navy, under the command of Admiral Sir William Parker, had already gained dominance over China's coastal defenses. The British attacked the city with their superior naval firepower and advanced weaponry, quickly overwhelming the Chinese defenses. Despite the best efforts of the Chinese to defend Canton, the city was strategically vulnerable. The British Navy easily breached the coastal defenses and began bombarding key positions. The fortifications in Canton, made of traditional materials, were no match for the British artillery, which could strike from great distances. The British also deployed ground troops to land and attack from multiple directions, further weakening Chinese resistance. The fall of Canton marked a significant turning point in the war. Not only was it a blow to Chinese prestige, but it also disrupted trade and commerce in a city that had been a critical point for the flow of goods and resources. After a prolonged siege and constant bombardment, Chinese forces in Canton were forced to surrender. The British now had control of a major port, severely weakening the Qing Dynasty's ability to maintain its defense against further British advances. In the months that followed, the British Navy continued its offensive along the Chinese coast, targeting key cities such as Chuzan and Ningbo. These cities were crucial to China's defense strategy and economy, and their fall further undermined China's ability to resist. British forces easily captured these cities, and the Qing government found itself increasingly incapable of defending its territory. By the middle of 1841, the Qing Dynasty had suffered a series of humiliating defeats. The capture of Canton and the subsequent fall of other key coastal cities exposed the sheer gap between British military power and China's outdated forces. The British, with their steam-powered warships, long-range artillery, and well-coordinated military campaigns, had inflicted devastating blows to China's economy, infrastructure, and military morale. The Chinese forces, on the other hand, were demoralized and ill-equipped to deal with the advanced tactics and technology employed by the British. The Qing government had attempted to rally its military, but the sheer effectiveness of the British military machine left them little room to maneuver. The Chinese Navy was still primarily reliant on wooden ships, which were no match for the steam-powered vessels of the British. Ground troops, despite their numerical advantage, lacked the training and equipment to face the British military, who used sophisticated weapons like rifled muskets and advanced artillery. The Chinese government, realizing the futility of continued military resistance, began to reassess its position. The Qing court was under immense pressure from both internal dissent and the external threat posed by the British. Public unrest was growing, with many Chinese citizens beginning to question the effectiveness of their leaders in handling the crisis. The government's failure to protect key cities and its inability to repel the British forces tarnished its credibility. By 1842, after a series of defeats and with no clear path to victory, the Qing government, under Emperor Daoguang, had no choice but to enter peace talks with Britain. The emperor, recognizing that further military resistance would only lead to greater devastation, instructed his representatives to negotiate with the British. The Chinese leadership understood that their sovereignty was at risk, and the war had already inflicted significant damage on the country's social and economic fabric. The decision to enter peace talks came after British forces had captured Shanghai and Ningbo and were preparing to advance further into the heart of China. The British had established complete dominance over China's coastline, and the Qing government faced the harsh reality that they could not continue to defend their territory. A peace settlement was now the only option to avoid further destruction and humiliation. The Treaty of Nanking, 1842. The Treaty of Nanking, signed on the 29th of August 1842, marked the formal end of the First Opium War between Britain and China. The treaty had profound and lasting implications for China, as it not only imposed humiliating concessions, but also set a precedent for future foreign influence and intervention in the country. In this section, we will take a detailed look at the terms of the treaty, the forced concessions China had to make, and the long-term impact on China's sovereignty and its relationship with global trade. The Treaty of Nanking was the first of the unequal treaties that China would be forced to sign with Western powers during the 19th century. The treaty was negotiated and signed under duress, with British military forces occupying key Chinese cities and the Qing government left with little choice but to accept the British terms. The treaty included several key provisions, many of which were heavily advantageous to Britain and deeply damaging to China's sovereignty. The terms reflected the imbalance of power between the two nations, as Britain used its superior military strength to impose terms that would ensure ongoing British dominance in Chinese trade and politics. One of the primary provisions of the treaty was the opening of Chinese ports to foreign trade. Previously, China had controlled foreign trade through limited ports, and foreign merchants were restricted to certain areas. However, the Treaty of Nanking forced China to open up 5 additional ports to foreign merchants: Canton, Guangzhou, Xiamen, Amoy, Fuzhou, Ningbo, and Shanghai. These ports would now be open to British traders, and British merchants could conduct trade freely, even within the Chinese interior. The treaty essentially shattered China's restrictive trade policies and allowed for the unrestricted flow of goods, including opium, into the country. Another key provision of the treaty was the cession of Hong Kong to Britain. The British had long coveted Hong Kong as a strategic port, and with the Treaty of Nanking, they gained control of the island. Hong Kong would become a British colony and a major base for British trade in East Asia. It also served as a foothold for Britain's future economic and political influence in the region. Additionally, the treaty required China to pay a substantial indemnity to Britain for the destruction of opium and the costs of the war. This indemnity, amounting to 21 million silver dollars, was to be paid in installments over the course of several years. The financial burden of the indemnity, along with the loss of Hong Kong and the opening of trade ports, severely weakened the Chinese economy and further increased the nation's dependence on foreign powers. The Treaty of Nanking, signed in 1842 after the British victory in the First Opium War, imposed several significant concessions on China. These provisions not only marked a humiliating defeat for the Qing Dynasty but also set the stage for a long period of foreign dominance over China. The consequences of these terms were profound and far-reaching, reshaping China's political, economic, and social landscape for decades to come. The cession of Hong Kong. One of the most significant and symbolically devastating aspects of the Treaty of Nanking was the cession of Hong Kong to Britain. Hong Kong, a small island located on China's southern coast, became a British colony under the terms of the treaty. The strategic location of the island made it an invaluable asset for the British Empire. Situated at the mouth of the Pearl River, Hong Kong was ideally positioned as a major port for trade between China and the rest of the world, particularly for the opium trade that had sparked the conflict. The loss of Hong Kong was not just a territorial concession, it symbolized China's diminished control over its own territory and represented the beginning of a new era of foreign interference and control. For over 150 years, Hong Kong remained under British rule, becoming one of the most important commercial hubs in the world. The cession of this vital piece of land marked the start of a period of imperial dominance along China's coastline, as foreign powers, including Britain, France, and later Japan, carved out their own spheres of influence in China. The Qing Dynasty's inability to protect its territory from foreign powers was a bitter blow to Chinese national pride. The loss of Hong Kong, coupled with other territorial concessions in later treaties, underscored China's vulnerability and foreshadowed the century of humiliation that the country would endure, during which foreign powers would continue to chip away at its sovereignty. The handover of Hong Kong in 1997 marked the end of over a century of British colonial rule, but the emotional and psychological scars of this long period of foreign domination continue to influence China's modern foreign policy and its national identity. The opening of 5 ports. Another key provision of the Treaty of Nanking was the opening of 5 Chinese ports to foreign trade. These ports, Canton, Guangzhou, Xiamen, Amoy, Fuzhou, Ningbo, and Shanghai, were once closed to foreign merchants, but the treaty forced China to open them to British traders and, by extension, to other Western powers. Before the treaty, China had maintained strict control over foreign trade, limiting foreign interactions to Canton under highly regulated conditions. This was designed to prevent the influx of foreign influence, particularly the opium trade, which China saw as a social and moral poison. However, under the treaty's terms, foreign merchants were granted unrestricted access to these new ports, opening the door to a massive influx of foreign goods, including opium, and allowing uncontrolled trade throughout China. The opening of these ports drastically weakened China's ability to control its domestic economy. Foreign merchants could now operate freely within China, enjoying favorable trading conditions that made it easier for them to extract wealth from the country. The lucrative opium trade continued to thrive, devastating Chinese society and draining China's silver reserves as the British demanded payment in silver for opium and other goods. The treaty forced China into a trade imbalance, where foreign merchants enjoyed better terms and protections than Chinese traders. This new economic dependence on foreign trade exacerbated the economic instability that had plagued China for years, and the country's traditional industries were undermined by the flood of cheap foreign goods. This further reinforced China's subjugation to Western powers as the Qing Dynasty's economic control weakened and foreign nations capitalized on the country's vulnerability. Indemnity payments. In addition to the territorial concessions, China was also forced to pay a substantial indemnity to Britain. The treaty stipulated that China pay 21 million silver dollars to Britain as compensation for the opium destroyed by the Qing government and for the costs incurred by the British military campaign. This indemnity was a crushing financial burden on the already weakened Qing government, which had been drained by the costs of the war and struggled to maintain control over its vast empire. The 21 million silver dollars were not only intended to compensate Britain for the destruction of opium, but also served as a reminder of China's subjugation to British imperial power. The payment was to be made in installments, stretching over several years, further straining the Chinese economy. These payments depleted China's silver reserves, which were essential to its monetary system, and exacerbated the country's financial difficulties. The financial burden of the indemnity had far-reaching consequences. As China's silver reserves dwindled, its ability to finance internal development, defend its borders, or support its military forces diminished. The outflow of silver caused inflation and economic instability within China, further weakening the Qing dynasty's authority and increasing popular discontent. This financial strain contributed to the social unrest and revolutionary movements that would eventually lead to the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1911. The indemnity payments also illustrated the way in which imperial powers used economic pressure to secure political and military control. The Treaty of Nanking set a precedent for further unequal treaties that would impose similar financial and territorial demands on China, further eroding the Qing dynasty's authority and undermining its sovereignty. The Treaty of Nanking marked the beginning of a new era of foreign influence and control over China. The long-term implications of the treaty would be felt for decades to come, affecting China's sovereignty, its economic systems, and its role in global trade. Loss of sovereignty. The Treaty of Nanking was a direct blow to China's sovereignty. By ceding Hong Kong to Britain, opening ports to foreign traders, and agreeing to pay a huge indemnity, China effectively relinquished control over its own economic and political affairs. The treaty set a precedent for future unequal treaties, in which China would be forced to make additional concessions to foreign powers, further undermining its autonomy. The century of humiliation. The Treaty of Nanking, along with subsequent treaties, is often cited as the beginning of China's century of humiliation, a period during which China was subjected to foreign exploitation, territorial concessions, and internal instability. The loss of Hong Kong, the imposition of indemnities, and the opening of Chinese markets to foreign powers all contributed to a national sense of humiliation and resentment toward the West. Impact on China's economy and society. The treaty's economic consequences were severe. The indemnity payments drained China's silver reserves and weakened the country's ability to invest in internal development. The opening of ports to foreign trade disrupted China's traditional economic systems, as foreign merchants flooded the market with Western goods. Moreover, the continuation of the opium trade was devastating for Chinese society, as addiction continued to spread, weakening China's social fabric. The shift in global trade. The Treaty of Nanking also had broader implications for global trade. By opening China's markets to foreign powers, the treaty facilitated the growth of a new global economic order in which Western nations, particularly Britain, gained greater access to Chinese resources and markets. This shift in global trade dynamics marked the beginning of Western dominance in Asia and the establishment of a system of imperialistic trade, where foreign powers could extract wealth from colonies and semi-colonies at the expense of local populations. The start of China's modernization efforts. The Treaty of Nanking, while humiliating, also set in motion efforts by China to modernize and reform. Over the following decades, Chinese intellectuals and reformers would begin to push for modernization to combat the growing influence of foreign powers. The treaty and its aftermath highlighted the need for China to strengthen its military, economy, and infrastructure in the face of growing Western imperialism. Immediate aftermath of the war, the Treaty of Nanking brought an end to the First Opium War, but its consequences reverberated throughout China for years to come. The immediate aftermath of the war saw dramatic changes in China's economic structure, the growth of foreign influence, and significant social unrest. The defeat marked the beginning of a long and painful period of decline for the Qing Dynasty, one that would have far-reaching consequences for China's future. In this section, we will explore the economic, political, and social impacts that followed the war and how they contributed to the weakening of the Qing government. The Treaty of Nanking, by imposing harsh economic terms on China, had a profound impact on its economy. One of the immediate consequences was the financial burden created by the indemnity payments. China was required to pay 21 million silver dollars to Britain in compensation for the destruction of opium and the costs of the war. This huge financial strain drained China's reserves and left the government with little room for domestic development or investment in national infrastructure. Beyond the indemnity, the cession of Hong Kong to Britain marked the loss of an important strategic trading port for China. Hong Kong, under British control, became a major hub for trade in East Asia, and much of the wealth that once flowed into China now bypassed the mainland, contributing to the weakening of China's financial position. Additionally, the opening of 5 more ports to foreign trade further undermined China's economic sovereignty. These ports, including Canton, Guangzhou, Xiamen, Fuzhou, Ningbo, and Shanghai, were now open to foreign merchants who were able to flood the market with Western goods. The influx of foreign goods disrupted the traditional Chinese economy and led to the gradual loss of control over domestic trade. The treaty's opening of China's markets also made the country increasingly dependent on foreign trade, especially in opium, which continued to be imported despite its negative effects on the population. This dependency on foreign trade and the constant outflow of silver contributed to economic instability in the country. The Treaty of Nanking was not just a military defeat for China. It was the beginning of an era in which foreign powers would have an increasing presence and influence in China. The treaty marked the start of a period of unequal treaties between China and Western powers, during which China was forced to make concessions to European and American nations. After the war, Britain and other Western powers, such as France and the United States, began to expand their influence over Chinese trade and politics. The opening of key ports to foreign merchants and the establishment of foreign-controlled areas within China led to an influx of Western businesses, missionaries, and diplomats into the country. Shanghai, for example, became a major foreign concession, with foreign powers establishing their own districts and enjoying special privileges under the protection of their governments. These foreign-controlled areas were often exempt from Chinese law and taxation, creating a dual economy in which Chinese businesses and citizens were subjugated to foreign dominance. The increased presence of foreign powers also led to a growing diplomatic imbalance. As more treaties were signed, granting further concessions to foreign powers, China found itself more and more at the mercy of Western interests. The growth of foreign trade in China, particularly the continued opium trade, also deepened China's dependence on Western markets and goods, further weakening its ability to control its own economy. While foreign influence in China grew, the Qing government was powerless to prevent it. The opening of additional ports, the forced payment of indemnities, and the establishment of extraterritorial rights for foreigners allowed Western powers to operate within China as though they were in their own territories, further stripping China of its sovereignty. The immediate aftermath of the war also saw significant social upheaval in China. The economic, political, and cultural changes brought about by the First Opium War exacerbated existing tensions within the country and contributed to the weakening of the Qing Dynasty. Widespread discontent. The humiliation of the Treaty of Nanking was felt deeply by the Chinese population. For many, it was not just an economic defeat, but a national disgrace. The loss of Hong Kong, the imposition of foreign influence, and the financial burden of indemnity payments contributed to a sense of national humiliation that spread throughout Chinese society. The population was angry at the Qing government for failing to protect China's sovereignty and prevent foreign domination. The opium crisis. The continued importation of opium, despite its detrimental effects on Chinese society, led to a growing opium epidemic. Addiction spread among all classes of society, weakening the workforce, destroying families, and draining the country's wealth. The Qing government's inability to control the opium trade, despite having defeated the foreign powers militarily, led to widespread frustration with the dynasty. The social fabric of China was unraveling, and the Qing government was increasingly seen as incapable of addressing the country's many problems. Peasant revolts and growing unrest. As the economic situation worsened and public dissatisfaction with the Qing government grew, peasant revolts became more frequent. The most significant of these was the Taiping Rebellion, 1850 to 1864, which erupted less than a decade after the Treaty of Nanking. The rebellion, led by Hong Xiuquan, was driven in part by resentment of the Qing dynasty's inability to defend China from foreign influence and address the widespread poverty and corruption in the empire. The rebellion would ultimately lead to the loss of millions of lives and would be a key event in the eventual fall of the Qing dynasty. The weakening of imperial authority. The Qing dynasty, already facing internal challenges from the emerging intellectual class and regional elites, found itself increasingly unable to maintain control over its vast empire. The defeat in the First Opium War was a major blow to the dynasty's legitimacy, and the loss of Hong Kong and the opening of more ports only highlighted the dynasty's weakness. Many reformers began to argue that China needed to modernize, but the Qing government was slow to respond to these calls for reform. The Qing court's failure to address the growing challenges of modernization and foreign encroachment contributed to the decline of the imperial system. The Second Opium War, 1856 to 1860. The First Opium War, though technically concluded with the Treaty of Nanking in 1842, did not resolve many of the underlying issues between China and the Western powers, especially Britain and France. The unresolved tensions over trade, sovereignty, and the opium trade itself would ultimately lead to a second conflict, one that would prove even more destructive for China. This section explores the events leading up to the Second Opium War, 1856 to 1860, the key battles during the war, and the additional concessions that China was forced to make to Britain and France. While the Treaty of Nanking had ended the First Opium War, it had left many issues unresolved. Although the treaty had forced China to open new ports to foreign trade, cede Hong Kong, and pay a hefty indemnity, it had not addressed the core grievances of the Western powers, particularly Britain. The opium trade. The opium trade continued to be a point of contention. Although China had made significant concessions, including allowing foreign merchants to operate freely, it still regarded the trade in opium as a moral and social menace. The British, on the other hand, were deeply invested in continuing the opium trade, seeing it as essential to balancing their trade deficit and maintaining their economic interests in China. China's inability to effectively end the trade led to continued tensions between the two sides. The failure of Chinese reform. In the years following the First Opium War, the Qing Dynasty failed to enact meaningful reforms to address the growing power of Western nations. China's resistance to further opening up to foreign powers and its reluctance to permit more free trade contributed to the ongoing frustration of the Western powers. While the Treaty of Nanking had forced China to open 5 new ports, it did not grant foreign powers the ability to establish embassies in Beijing or fully access the interior of China. The Arrow Incident, 1856. The immediate catalyst for the Second Opium War was the Arrow Incident of 1856. The incident involved the Chinese authorities boarding a British registered vessel, the Arrow, which was accused of piracy. The Chinese had detained the crew and removed the British flag, which the British saw as an affront to their national honor. The British used the incident as a pretext for military action, demanding that China apologize, pay reparations, and give full access to more ports. When China refused, Britain, supported by France, declared war. The French also had grievances of their own, as they sought to secure their own missionary rights and privileges in China. The Second Opium War was marked by several significant military engagements and a marked escalation in the scale of conflict. The Western powers, mainly Britain and France, were determined to force China into further concessions and to ensure their economic and political control over the country. The Siege of Canton, 1856 to 1857. The war began with the British and French forces besieging Canton, Guangzhou, just as they had done in the First Opium War. However, this time the conflict quickly spread beyond Canton. The British and French, joined by additional forces, captured the city after heavy fighting, signaling the start of the wider war. The Battle of the Bogue, 1857. One of the significant naval engagements in the war was the Battle of the Bogue, where British and French forces attacked the Chinese defenses in the Bogue, Human Strait. The superior British and French naval forces, equipped with modern steam-powered warships and artillery, easily overwhelmed the Chinese fleet. This naval victory allowed the Western forces to establish a foothold along China's southern coast, eventually leading to the capture of other strategic cities. The capture of Tianjin, 1858. In 1858, British and French forces advanced towards the northern part of China and captured the city of Tianjin, an important city located near Beijing. The capture of Tianjin marked a critical step in the Western powers' push to reach the Chinese capital. It also led to more negotiations, but the Qing government, still reluctant to give in to foreign demands, continued to resist. The capture of Beijing, 1860. The final and most decisive event of the war was the capture of Beijing in 1860. Following the Battle of Tianjin, British and French forces advanced towards the capital. When the Qing government refused to make further concessions, the Allied forces marched into Beijing, where they looted the Summer Palace, Yihiwan, the emperor's lavish residence. As a symbolic act of retribution, the sacking of the Summer Palace became one of the most infamous moments in the war, symbolizing the humiliation and complete defeat of China. The Second Opium War ended with another humiliating treaty for China, known as the Treaty of Tianjin, 1858, and the Convention of Peking, 1860. These treaties imposed additional concessions on China, further eroding its sovereignty and opening it up even more to foreign exploitation. The opening of more ports. The Treaty of Tientsin and the subsequent Convention of Peking further expanded the number of ports China was required to open to foreign trade. 10 new ports were added to the previous 5, further opening China's economic and cultural space to Western influence. The freedom of foreign trade within China was now assured, and foreign merchants could operate freely within the interior. The legalization of the opium trade. One of the major outcomes of the Second Opium War was the legalization of the opium trade. Despite China's initial resistance, the British and French demanded that China officially permit the trade in opium. This allowed British merchants to continue their highly profitable opium trade with China without the restrictions that had been placed on it after the First Opium War. The cession of more territory. The Treaty of Peking added new territorial concessions to the previous ones. Port Arthur and Dalian were ceded to Russia, while Taiwan and the Pescadores Islands were ceded to Japan, further weakening China's territorial integrity. Missionary rights and religious freedoms. The treaties also granted religious freedoms to foreign missionaries, allowing them to establish churches and spread Christianity throughout China. This provision was a significant step in the spread of Western culture and religious influence in China, further deepening the divide between the Qing government and the population, many of whom were resistant to foreign religions and influences. Indemnity payments. Just as with the First Opium War, China was required to pay indemnities to the foreign powers. The cost of the war and the indemnities further drained China's already weakened economy, making it more reliant on foreign trade and exposing it to even greater foreign influence. The long-term consequences. The First and Second Opium Wars, culminating in the series of treaties that followed, had profound long-term consequences for China. The repercussions of these wars not only affected China's sovereignty, economy, and international standing, but also deeply impacted its society, particularly in terms of the unequal treaties that would dominate its foreign relations for decades. This section delves into the creation of these treaties, their lasting effects on China's sovereignty, and the societal impact, especially regarding the persistent issue of opium. One of the most significant long-term consequences of the Opium Wars was the creation of a series of unequal treaties. These treaties were signed under duress, with China having little to no bargaining power, and they marked the beginning of a century of foreign domination and exploitation. Unequal treaties. The Treaty of Nanking, 1842, was the first of many unequal treaties that China would be forced to sign. These treaties imposed severe restrictions on China's sovereignty, giving foreign powers a significant presence in China's territory. Under these treaties, China was forced to open additional ports to foreign trade, allow foreign missionaries, cede valuable territories, and pay indemnities to the foreign powers involved in the wars. Over time, similar treaties were imposed by other Western powers like the United States, France, and Russia, further eroding China's control over its own affairs. The most notable example of this continued encroachment was the Treaty of Tientsin, 1858, and the Convention of Peking, 1860, which expanded foreign-controlled areas and granted even more privileges to Western nations, including the extraterritorial rights of foreign nationals in Chinese territories. Foreign-controlled areas. The creation of foreign-controlled areas called concessions became a key feature of China's new reality. Cities like Shanghai, Hong Kong, Tianjin, and Canton saw the establishment of foreign settlements, which were effectively independent of Chinese law and government. These foreign-controlled areas allowed foreign nations to conduct trade, maintain diplomatic missions, and even exercise their own legal jurisdiction over foreigners living in China. This process was formalized through the establishment of foreign concessions, where European powers and Japan enjoyed unprecedented influence and control. The foreign settlements in Shanghai, for example, became a thriving hub of international trade, with Britain, France, and the United States running their own territories within the city. This development created a stark contrast between the Western-controlled enclaves and the rest of China, which remained under the authority of the Qing Dynasty. This division not only disrupted China's internal unity but also marked the start of a long period of foreign domination. The series of defeats and unequal treaties left China's sovereignty in a state of profound crisis. The Qing dynasty had to contend with increasing foreign pressure, not just from Britain, but from multiple Western powers, each seeking to expand their own influence over China. The consequences for Chinese sovereignty were far-reaching and long-lasting. Loss of autonomy. The most immediate effect of the Opium Wars and the unequal treaties was the significant loss of China's autonomy. Western powers now had the ability to dictate terms to China, imposing their will through military threats and diplomatic pressure. The Qing government found itself unable to resist foreign demands, further weakening its control over its own territory. Continued foreign encroachment. The treaties, while technically concluding the Opium Wars, marked the beginning of continued foreign encroachment into China. Each subsequent treaty and foreign intervention further eroded China's sovereignty. For example, Japan's victory in the First Sino-Japanese War, 1894 to 1895, led to the Treaty of Shimonoseki, which resulted in the cession of Taiwan to Japan and added to China's growing list of territorial losses. Similarly, Russia, Germany, and other powers carved out additional concessions, further fragmenting China's territory. China as a semi-colony. The long-term effect was that China became a semi-colonial state, with foreign powers exerting significant control over its economy, political structure, and even its legal system. These powers dictated trade policies, enforced the opium trade, and operated with impunity in the foreign-controlled territories. The Chinese government's authority, weakened by internal corruption and the ongoing influence of foreign powers, struggled to assert control over its own land and people. The societal impact of the Opium Wars was devastating, particularly in relation to the opium trade, which remained a critical issue for China long after the wars. Despite the British victory, the opium epidemic continued to spread, with the drug deeply ingrained in Chinese society and contributing to social instability. The opium epidemic. The Opium Wars did not end the opium trade. If anything, they solidified it. With the Treaty of Nanking, Britain gained a legal right to continue the opium trade, making it a permanent fixture of China's relationship with foreign powers. The opium trade became a major economic driver for the British East India Company and other foreign traders. And even after the war, opium continued to flow into China in large quantities. The widespread addiction to opium had devastating consequences for Chinese society. Millions of Chinese citizens became addicted, weakening the workforce and draining China's wealth. The social and economic effects of addiction were felt across all levels of society, from the poorest peasants to the highest ranks of government officials. Families were destroyed, and many individuals saw their lives ruined by their dependence on the drug. The widespread addiction further contributed to the internal strife and social unrest that would later erupt in movements like the Taiping Rebellion, 1850 to 1864, which would devastate China. The failure to combat opium. Despite efforts by the Qing government to ban opium, the trade remained a powerful force. The government struggled to enforce the ban, particularly after the British insisted on their right to continue the opium trade as part of the terms of the peace treaties. China's inability to stop the influx of opium further undermined the legitimacy of the Qing dynasty. fueling growing dissatisfaction among the people and contributing to revolutionary sentiments. The social divide. Opium addiction also reinforced existing social divisions in China. The wealthier classes could afford the opium and often consumed it in private, while the poorer classes were more directly affected by the widespread addiction. The social inequality created by the opium trade was a stark reflection of the economic exploitation imposed by foreign powers and was a source of growing resentment. This resentment contributed to the many uprisings and revolts that occurred throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. Legacy and impact on global history. The Opium Wars, while deeply consequential for China, also had a lasting impact on global history, shaping not only China's future but also influencing the geopolitical dynamics of the 19th and 20th centuries. The wars marked the beginning of an era of imperialism and unequal treaties that would affect many nations, not just China, and set the stage for the rise of new powers and the reordering of the global economic system. In this section, we explore the long-term effects of the Opium Wars on world history, how the wars shaped China's modern approach to foreign relations and sovereignty, and the role they played in China's rise as a global power in the 20th and 21st centuries. The Opium Wars are often seen as pivotal moments in the history of imperialism and the establishment of the modern world order. While the wars were primarily fought between China and Western powers, their implications reverberated far beyond China's borders. The rise of imperialism. The Opium Wars are seen as emblematic of the imperialist era of the 19th century, where Western powers, particularly Britain, France, and later Japan, used military force and diplomatic pressure to expand their global influence. The unequal treaties imposed on China created a system of imperialistic trade in which foreign powers could extract wealth from weaker nations. The wars set a precedent for the treatment of other non-Western nations by imperial powers, as they began to force open markets and extract resources from colonies and semi-colonies around the world. The spread of Western influence. The wars facilitated the spread of Western culture, technology, and capitalism across the globe. The Treaty of Nanking and the subsequent treaties forced China to open its markets to foreign goods, leading to a greater exchange of products, ideas, and technologies between East and West. The effects of this globalization were profound, influencing the development of the global economy and creating a complex web of interconnected nations. The expansion of global trade networks. The treaties that followed the Opium Wars opened up key Chinese ports to international trade, not only for Britain but also for other global powers like France, the United States, and Japan. This expansion of trade routes, especially the opium trade, had wide-ranging effects on the global economy. The trade imbalance caused by the flow of opium into China led to economic instability and dependency, while simultaneously fueling the economies of the Western powers involved in the trade. A shift in power dynamics. The Opium Wars also represented a shift in the global power dynamics. The successful imposition of Western demands on China marked the beginning of the decline of traditional Chinese power and the Qing Dynasty. The wars highlighted the West's growing military, economic, and political dominance over China, and later other parts of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. The resulting dominance of Western powers helped shape the international political and economic systems that emerged in the 20th century, including the development of the global capitalist system. The defeat in the Opium Wars had a profound impact on China's approach to foreign relations and sovereignty, leaving a legacy that lasted well into the 20th century. The century of humiliation. The Opium Wars and the subsequent unequal treaties began what is often referred to in China as the Century of Humiliation. This period, which lasted from the mid-19th century to the mid-20th century, was marked by the loss of territory, sovereignty, and independence as foreign powers carved out spheres of influence in China. This period deeply affected China's national psyche, fostering a sense of national shame and resentment toward foreign powers. These sentiments fueled nationalist movements throughout the 20th century and shaped China's modern approach to defending its sovereignty. Reform and modernization efforts. In response to the humiliation of the Opium Wars and subsequent defeats, China began to recognize the need for modernization to catch up with the military and technological advancements of the West. The self-strengthening movement, 1861–1895, was one of China's earliest attempts to modernize its military and industry, though it met with limited success. Over time, the failure to effectively modernize and the continued foreign domination contributed to the fall of the Qing Dynasty in 1911 and the establishment of the Republic of China. A new foreign policy. The memory of the Opium Wars shaped China's foreign policy for decades. The humiliation faced during the wars led to the development of a foreign policy focused on protecting sovereignty and reasserting national pride. In the 20th century, China became increasingly focused on preventing further foreign intervention, and its resistance to imperialism became a central theme in its national identity. The May 4th Movement, 1919, and the Chinese Communist Revolution, 1949, were in part reactions against the legacy of foreign domination, with China seeking to reclaim its independence and assert itself as a global power. The impact of the Opium Wars on China's future trajectory was not only a story of humiliation and defeat, but also of resilience and eventual revival. Over the course of the 20th and 21st centuries, China emerged from the ashes of the Opium Wars to become one of the world's most powerful nations, though the legacy of the wars remained an important part of the national narrative. The end of the century of humiliation. The end of the century of humiliation came with the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949, following a long struggle for national liberation and self-determination. The Chinese Communist Party, under Mao Zedong, focused on restoring China's sovereignty, and the country sought to throw off the legacy of foreign control and humiliation. Mao's leadership marked the beginning of a shift from weakness to strength, and the quest for national dignity became a central goal of China's foreign and domestic policies. Economic reforms and global integration. In the late 20th century, particularly after Deng Xiaoping's economic reforms in the 1982, China began a rapid process of economic modernization. The country opened its markets to the global economy, embarked on market-oriented reforms, and began to integrate into the global trade system. This economic resurgence has been one of the most remarkable transformations in modern history. China's rise as a global power. By the 21st century, China had transformed itself into an economic superpower, becoming the world's second-largest economy and a leading player in global trade, technology, and geopolitics. China's rise as a global power is partly rooted in its desire to reclaim the position it once held in East Asia and the world before the humiliation of the Opium Wars. The country's focus on sovereignty, economic strength, and global influence is in many ways a reaction to the subjugation experienced during the Opium Wars and subsequent periods of foreign control. The legacy of the Opium Wars in modern Chinese identity. China's rise as a global power has been accompanied by a nationalist narrative that is deeply rooted in the trauma of the Opium Wars. The memory of these wars continues to shape China's approach to foreign policy, with a strong emphasis on preserving national dignity, protecting sovereignty, and preventing foreign interference. The Opium Wars serve as a reminder of the nation's past struggles and resilience, and the desire to never again be subjected to the terms of unequal treaties drives China's modern foreign policy. China's position in the global arena. As China continues to rise on the global stage, it has taken an increasingly assertive stance in international relations, challenging Western dominance in trade, politics, and technology. China's Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, its growing influence in the United Nations, and its technological advancements, particularly in artificial intelligence and renewable energy, all signify its return to a position of strength on the world stage. The legacy of the Opium Wars, in many ways, serves as a backdrop to this transformation, symbolizing China's journey from subjugation to global leadership. Interesting facts and anecdotes. Before we close this historical journey, let's take a moment to uncover some fascinating, lesser-known stories from the time of the Opium Wars, tales that reveal the human side of this complex period and offer fresh insight into how this era is remembered today. The strange diplomacy of tea and opium. It's ironic the very tea that British citizens adored back home was one of the main reasons these wars happened in the first place. By the early 1800s, Britain's daily tea habit was so immense that millions of pounds of silver were flowing out of London to pay for it. Some historians estimate that over 30 million pounds of tea were imported annually from China, more tea than any other nation consumed at the time. To fix the trade imbalance, British merchants turned to India's opium. In essence, Britain was trading addiction for tea, a haunting reflection of how economics can drive moral contradictions. As one British parliamentarian of the era cynically put it, "We may drink our tea, but China drinks our sorrow." The man who tried to stop a nation's addiction. Commissioner Lin Zexu, the man who led China's anti-opium campaign, is still celebrated today as a symbol of integrity and national pride. What many people don't know is that before launching his crackdown, Lin wrote an open letter to Queen Victoria herself, pleading for Britain to stop selling opium to China, asking, how could such a poison be permitted to enter another land? The letter never received an official reply. It's a haunting reminder of how moral appeals were often drowned out by imperial interests. The battle that changed modern warfare. The Battle of the Bogue, Human Strait, during the First Opium War, showcased one of history's earliest examples of steam-powered naval warfare. British ironclad ships, powered by coal and steam rather than wind, completely outclassed the traditional wooden Chinese junks. Witnesses described the Chinese soldiers firing muskets and cannons that barely reached the enemy ships, while the British, using modern artillery, decimated entire fortifications from afar. The battle symbolized a stark new age, the age of industrial warfare. The sacking of the Summer Palace Beauty in flames. During the Second Opium War, British and French troops captured Beijing in 1860. When negotiations broke down, they looted and burned the Emperor's Summer Palace, one of the most magnificent architectural treasures of imperial China. It wasn't just a palace. It was a cultural jewel filled with priceless art, calligraphy, and artifacts from across dynasties. The looting shocked even some British officers. One soldier wrote in his diary, "We destroyed in a few hours what had taken centuries to build. I felt more shame than triumph." Today, the ruins of the Summer Palace still stand a silent reminder of that day. A modern reflection, historians, on the Opium Wars today. Modern historians view the Opium Wars not just as a clash of empires, but as a story of globalization's dark beginnings. Dr. Julia Lovell, a leading historian on the subject, calls it the moment when China and the West truly collided, and neither would ever be the same again. In China, these wars are still taught as the starting point of the century of humiliation. but they're also seen as the origin of the nation's drive to rise again to reclaim dignity, strength, and independence on the world stage. For the West, the Opium Wars serve as a cautionary tale, a reminder of how economic ambition, unchecked by morality, can reshape the destiny of nations. Thank you for staying with me through this incredible journey into one of the most defining chapters of world history. If you enjoyed these fascinating stories, please give this video a like, subscribe to the channel, and share your favorite fun fact in the comments below. Which of these stories surprised you the most? I'd love to hear your thoughts. And remember, history is always richer when we explore it together. Until next time, thank you for watching, and see you in the next episode of our historical adventure. The Lessons of History. As we reflect on the story of the Opium Wars, we come to understand the profound lessons of history, not just for China, but for the entire world. The Opium Wars were not just about trade or military victories. They were a turning point in the global order, shaping international relations, economic systems, and power dynamics for generations to come. The Opium Wars were pivotal in the establishment of a global imperialist system, where stronger powers imposed their will on weaker nations. For China, the wars marked the start of a century of humiliation. But they also set the stage for global trade networks and Western dominance in international affairs. The treaties that followed, especially the unequal treaties, set the precedent for foreign intervention and the creation of trade systems that prioritized the interests of imperial powers over the sovereignty of weaker nations. These events were a direct catalyst for the rise of Western imperialism, which extended far beyond China to influence global geopolitics in the 19th and 20th centuries. One of the most significant lessons of the Opium Wars lies in the stark reality of imperialism and how military force can be used to achieve economic goals. The British, in their desire to control the opium trade and address trade imbalances, demonstrated the power of imperialist tactics, using military power to force open markets, impose political and economic control, and extract resources from other nations. This strategy of gunboat diplomacy was not exclusive to China. It shaped the foreign policy of imperial powers across the world during this period. The wars also underscore the importance of economic interests in shaping foreign policy and international relations, as nations have historically used their economic power and military might to secure access to valuable resources and markets. The legacy of the Opium Wars continues to resonate in modern international relations, especially in the dynamic between the East and the West. The wars fostered deep resentment in China, which still views this period as a painful chapter in its history. However, the wars also laid the foundation for China's modern resurgence as a global power. Today, China's approach to foreign relations is heavily influenced by the desire to protect sovereignty and avoid foreign dominance, a reflection of the historical trauma caused by the Opium Wars. For the West, the wars were a reminder of the power that imperialism once held. However, in today's interconnected world, the lessons of the Opium Wars also remind us of the dangers of using military power for economic gain and the long-term consequences of disregarding the sovereignty of other nations. The global trade system that emerged from these wars has evolved, but the dynamics of power, exploitation, and economic competition still shape much of modern diplomacy and international relations. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through history. We've just scratched the surface of the complex legacy left by the Opium Wars, and I hope you've gained some valuable insights into how they shape the world we live in today. If you enjoyed this video and found it informative, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into history and international relations. Your support means the world, and I'd love to have you join me on future historical adventures. Also, Feel free to leave a comment with your thoughts on the Opium Wars, or let me know what other topics you'd like me to cover in the future. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.